So I've only recently become interested in the Battletech Mechwarrior franchise. As for the longest time, it was barely even a blip on my radar. I had really only encountered it once or twice from my childhood, and that was it, really. I first remember the Mechwarrior games specifically, and for the longest time having no idea that it was connected to Battletech at all. I had been given a used PlayStation 1 as a gift, and one day, while I was browsing at GameStop, back when they used to sell PlayStation 1 games, I found a used copy of Mechwarrior 2. Granted, I had no idea what a Mechwarrior was at the time, but having seen the Timberwolf proudly displayed on the front cover, I was hooked, and I knew I had to check it out. I remember watching the intro and having no idea what anyone was talking about or what was happening, but there was a wolf on one side, a falcon on the other, and hey, they both had cool mechs, so I figured that I'd read the manual later and try to piece everything together if I liked playing. I had done the same thing with my copy of Spyro 2, so I figured I would get similar results. However, due to the more simulator-like gameplay as well as not really having a good idea of what was happening, I soon lost interest. This really wasn't the game's fault, however, as I generally preferred more arcade-style games like Rogue Squadron, but I still gave it a fair chance, and even with the manual's help, I really didn't have an interest in playing. Zoids kind of took over from there in terms of my attention to giant robots along with Transformers, though every now and again I'd browse the cutscenes for the various Mechwarrior games on YouTube as well as game footage, and that's how it was, until recently that is. Remembering how awesome the Timberwolf was is what jump-started my interest in Mechwarrior again. I never really got over that first impression. It was such a cool-looking machine that it inspired me to take a deeper look to really try to understand how the Mechwarrior universe worked. And in doing so, I discovered the Battletech tabletop game. In my searches, I've settled on quite a few mech designs that I really like, and have found models for on the tabletop. However, I haven't really been satisfied with the current metal or plastic offerings, so I've opted to go for 3D printed ones instead, which tend to resemble their in-game designs rather than their modern reimaginings. And I wanted to do a little video showcasing the different mechs that I have in my collection. Most of the mechs that I tend to like belong to the faction called the Clans, with Clan Wolf being my favorite. So, without further ado, let's get into my 3D printed Battletech mech collection. So the first mech we have here is, without a doubt in my mind, the mech that got me interested in the franchise, the Timberwolf, also known as the Mad Cat. I adore this mini to death. It's the classic sculpt increased in size to the more modern scale of the currently released plastic miniatures without sacrificing details, making it identical to the older version of the mech as compared to the newer modern version. This is the design that I prefer, as the more modern versions of the Timberwolf tend to be more blockier than how it was depicted originally. This mech is really detailed for how small it is. The cockpit windows, the missiles on the shoulder, and the small parts on the legs are all rendered very, very well. This mech's going to be fun to paint. I've been thinking about a paint scheme that might involve teeth under the cockpit windows, just like a World War II fighter plane. Something aggressive and meaning business, but I haven't figured out 100% how I want to paint my mechs up just yet. And here we have the 3D printed Timberwolf compared to a modern plastic mech. If my memory is right, this mech is called a Banshee. The seller that I purchased these 3D printed mechs from said that the 3D printed mechs are in scale with the new plastic ones, but I'm not entirely sure if this is accurate or not. I think if I were to print these mechs myself, I'd probably upscale them a bit for display pieces rather than game pieces. The level of details seem to be pretty significant, as the plastic mech's details seem to be a lot softer, while the 3D printed mech, for example, what seems to be fans on the back of the model, are a lot crisper and more defined. Lastly, let's take a look at the bases. Each one of the mechs I ordered comes with a base like this, separate from the mech itself. The bases are roughly the same size as the ones mounted on the plastic mech. Granted, the plastics do have a taller footprint. Though I think in the future I'll end up giving them diorama bases, or leaving them without bases, as I'm not really a fan of how they look, given that a majority of the models I have are too large for the bases themselves. I understand that this is how it has generally been for the game, but this is more of a personal preference of mine. As when I play Warhammer, I tend to leave larger vehicles like the dreadnoughts and creatures off their bases if they can support their own weights. But overall, I am definitely a fan of how this Timberwolf looks, and I'm glad that I added it to my collection. Next, we have another one of my favorites. This mech is a direwolf. This mech looks like a Timberwolf, and it shares a similar profile, but looks a lot more heavily armored. I like the pose this one is in too. The way the legs are articulated and posed, as if it was in motion rather than being static, makes for nice variety in displaying these guys, and it would look pretty cool in a diorama as well. The details on this one are rendered very well too, even down to the missile pod firing ports, and the tiny guns in the center of the arms are detailed as well. It always amazes me how well some of these prints come out for how small they are. And now we have a quick side-by-side comparing the Timberwolf and the Direwolf. They really look good next to each other, and I think I prefer my mechs to be in motion as it gives the models a bit more character. Next, we have the Summoner. I originally disliked the Summoner for how stocky and flat it looked, and how different it was compared to the other mechs that I liked. That changed when I checked out the Battletech animated series, in which a Summoner is piloted by the main Jade Falcon antagonist. Not to spoil anything major about the show, but the mech's performance in the show really changed my mind about it. Next, after the Summoner, we have the Adder. It's a smaller mech than the rest of them, and from what I've read, it seems like it would make for a good skirmisher or semi-scout mech compared to the rest of my models, which helps it stand out despite its smaller size. I like how, much like the Summoner, the torso is rotated slightly, and it looks like it's aiming at something off in the distance, and here it is compared to the Timberwolf. While much smaller, it is a really cool model, and I wanted to add a bit of variety to my collection with this mech. After the Adder, we have the Supernova. I thought this one was neat given its sort of unusual posture and loadout being composed entirely of laser weaponry, which I think is awesome. I think that it'll be neat to make the lasers glowing when I paint this model up, perhaps in a color that contrasts the rest of the mech to make them stand out. The cockpit and top torso design look very sleek, almost like a Pelican from Halo or some kind of jet aircraft. It's also posed aggressively to where it's firing mid-stride. After the Supernova, we have one of the few Mad Dogs that I picked up. That being said, the detail on these guys are immaculate. The barrels of the weapons are rendered too in tiny detail, however they are definitely very fragile. This Mad Dog is one of the few in better shape that I have. The second Mad Dog of the lot is actually broken. It didn't survive a small fall. I think I'm definitely going to have to order a replacement, especially since this one, as far as I can remember, is the classic Mad Dog and my favorite out of all the variants. I would say that's probably my only gripe with these models, that while they do convey a lot of the classic game designs very well, they are extremely delicate, and if you drop or mishandle one, they are definitely going to break. And here we have the third variant of the Mad Dog in my collection. This one has shorter arms and a turret under the chin, as well as missile racks on the shoulders like the others have. I like how sort of compact this one looks, as I believe I remember that it shows up in one of the live-action Battletech game intros, throwing out a lot of suppressing fire. And finally, we have the last Mad Dog out of the lot. This one's a bit of an oddity, as it's armed with something I've never really seen before, these large weapons on both of the arms. I asked around a bit, and after talking to some people who are into Battletech and know a lot more than I do, even they weren't entirely sure as what variant that this model is supposed to be. This is due to the fact that it doesn't 100% fit the description of any of the known Mad Dog variants. I believe that this mech is supposed to be the Mad Dog C variant, which has two Gauss rifles for arm-mounted weapons, and in doing so removes every other weapon system. However, this model seems to be retaining the missile racks on the shoulders, which perhaps could have been the artist's version of the C variant. And that's all the mechs I've collected so far. I'm certainly going to be painting these guys up as Clan Wolf mechs in the future, and I'll be sure to post updates on these guys when I can. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all enjoyed. Which mech was your favorite? Feel free to let me know, and I might do another video on it someday.